Camping on Thanksgiving was horrible, by Harrisonprince. Thanksgiving break was, in a word, insane. A nightmare. My family has never gotten along, and I don't talk to them aside from my brother. We all hold some differing views on politics, happiness, and life in general. James and I are close because when we talk about those topics, he just listens. Never offers his own opinion. He won't say whether it's because he has no opinion or because he doesn't want to fight with me. Regardless, we're closer than anyone else in the family. Instead of going to dinner for Thanksgiving, James recommended that we go camp out in the canyon. We'd make our own tinfoil dinners with mashed potatoes, beef chunks, and vegetables. I thought it sounded much better than sitting at home while all my friends were with their families, so he picked me up the day before Thanksgiving and we went to the store for supplies. James is 21 and moved out at 18. I'm only 17 and can't wait to get out in 6 months. He's more civil towards Mom and Dad than I am, which makes me want to act better. You would think that Mom and I would get along since we're both girls, but we don't. You might also think that I'd be a daddy's girl and get along with him. Nope. Anyway, I keep going off on how angry I am at them. Probably because I wrote this just after having a fight with Mom. So, we went to the store, collected our supplies, and headed up the canyon. The campsites were deserted, as you might expect on the day before Thanksgiving. It was chilly, but the state hadn't closed down the campgrounds yet. Snow is usually delayed where we are. Our perfect campsite was 3 miles from the main canyon road. I even had cell reception, though I kept my phone off so my brother wouldn't be offended by me not spending quality time with him. I got out of the car and flinched away from the ice-cold breeze. It was significantly colder up the canyon. "Good thing we brought the winter coats," James commented as he lifted the trunk and threw a coat at me. I put it on, and he dumped the large bundle of tarp and cloth that was our tent. "Let's set up the tent first. We'll thank ourselves later," he said. He was quite the outdoorsman, so I didn't doubt his advice. I didn't camp often, and it was only with him when I did. Camping with my parents was out of the question. James kicked rocks and sticks out of a clearing, and I unrolled the tent there. We stuck the long poles through their proper sleeves, and the tent was up in minutes. James drove stakes into the ground, and I dumped our sleeping bags, clothing bags, and pillows into the tent. Next came the fire, which James had me do so I could practice. We didn't camp that often, but when we did, he insisted that I practice at least one survival skill. I would complain only when I struggled to complete the task. Starting the fire, under his instruction, was easy. We set a tablecloth over the picnic table that was bolted down, and I began to slice potatoes, onions, and carrots, while James cut up the meat into bite-sized chunks. Once the fire had a sufficient amount of red coals, we set our tinfoil clumps into the fire, buried them, and sat together on the picnic bench. I had put gloves and boots on as the sun lowered down. James had done the same. The instant the sun dropped below the mountain tops, we started shivering. James brought out some camping chairs, and we huddled as close to the fire as possible. We talked a little. He asked about my schoolwork and grades, and I told him they were good enough. He asked about college and about how he'd take twice the amount of time to graduate because he had to work at the same time. He was determined to get out of college with no debt, and even made the side comment that Mom and Dad's marriage was so terrible because of money. I listened as he gave me advice about going to college and answered when he asked what kind of careers I might look at. We pulled our dinners out of the fire as we talked and ate the steaming food gingerly. Technically, Thanksgiving wasn't until the next day, but we considered this our Thanksgiving meal. We'd stay out one more night after this before heading home. James had to work. Tomorrow would just be snacks and junk food. At 10 p.m., we were both full and sleepy, so we rolled up our empty tinfoil, stuck it in a garbage bag, and locked the food, utensils, and trash in the car. We knew about hiding food to keep bears or other critters from smelling their way into camp. In the freezing cold, we unrolled our sleeping bags and clambered inside. I stripped down to my underwear inside my sleeping bag, spitting up clothes as if the sleeping bag were regurgitating the parts of me that it couldn't digest. I'm shy, even in front of my brother, so this wasn't uncommon. He just rolled over and started to sleep. I pulled out my phone, turned on my mobile data, and started surfing Reddit and Facebook, looking for things I'd missed throughout the day. After about a half hour of searching, I turned it off, stuck it into my duffel bag, and laid back to sleep. It was late when I woke up. Not early, but definitely late. You know what I mean. I had to pee, but when I put my arms out of the sleeping bag and felt how cold it was, I resisted. I could make it till morning, I convinced myself. When I rolled over to try and coax myself back to sleep, my arm fell on my duffel bag for a moment. It was ice cold. As in, there were snowy ice crystals all over the surface. It must have gotten colder than we'd anticipated. My entire sleeping bag crunched when I moved, sounding like I was sleeping on snow. After 5 minutes of tossing and turning, I knew I had to pee. There was no way around it. I grabbed my pants and dragged them into my sleeping bag. I about yelped when they touched my skin. Ice crystals flaked everywhere in my bag, making me flinch with every contact. James stirred, so I tried to be quieter as I pulled them on. Then came my shirt. Socks. I climbed out of my bag, slipped my shoes on, and unzipped the tent. The zipper was deafening in the cold silence. My breath clouded in front of me, and I felt its warmth on my thumb as I lifted the zipper. "Rip it up, like a Band-Aid," James complained from his sleeping bag. I whispered an apology and opened the tent flap quickly. The night was darker than usual. The clouds hid the moon and stars, leaving the night in darkness. I grabbed my small flashlight from my duffel bag, then zipped the tent back up halfway. I stepped off into the trees, squatted, and did my business. The relief was instantaneous, and I was glad to get it out of my system. When I turned around, something flickered. Like passing a mirror and a small reflection of light hits your eye just right. A flicker. I stopped and looked around, waving my flashlight everywhere except over the tent. I didn't want to wake James. Nothing. There were no birds, animals, or insects because of how cold it was. Just dead silent. I heaved a heavy breath of cloudy mist before crunching back to the tent and climbing inside. I pulled the zipper down to the floor, took off my shoes, and climbed into my bag. I undressed the same way as before and rolled over to sleep. Buzzing woke me up. Almost like a bee was in the tent, or any other insect. I was annoyed at first. It wouldn't be the first time that an insect woke me up while we were camping. I opened my eyes sleepily and saw the reflective ice on my duffel bag. Then I remembered how freezing it was. An insect flying around in this weather? I raised my head and saw it. The zipper was slowly raising itself from the floor. It was about 4 inches off the ground, and the tent flaps were parting as it rose. Paralyzed with fear, my throat closed up as I watched it. My neck started to feel cramped from watching it at an awkward angle, but I didn't dare move. With my eyes, I glanced over at James's bag. He was fast asleep. I could hear him breathing softly. Ever so slowly, I lowered my head to the pillow. I raised my arm out of my sleeping bag with terrorized precision. My fingers hit the sleeping bag zipper, and I held my breath. The zipper kept rising. It was 6 inches tall now. I swallowed before reaching for the flashlight next to my duffel bag. James was too far away to wake without alerting who or whatever was at the zipper. It was either an animal or a person. Both would likely be scared away by a flashlight lighting up. It would wake James at the same time. It was a risk, but the only other option was to wait for them to finish opening the tent. Who knew what would happen then? My hands trembled as I put my thumb on the button, aimed towards the flap, and click. Instantly, something scrambled on the other side, and I clenched my teeth as I listened to it run away. I could hear its footsteps on the gravel until it was out of earshot. Definitely human. The two-legged running was unmistakable. Late, as usual, James woke up and complained about the light. When I didn't answer, he sat up and looked at me. I didn't say anything, just pointed to the tent zipper. He looked at it, saw my expression, and bit his lip. "I'll check it out," he said, probably thinking I'd woken up and seen the zipper already open. "No," I whispered. "They were right there, just seconds ago. I turned on the flashlight and they ran away." "What?" he hissed. With one arm, he snatched his t-shirt from the floor and slipped it on. "God, it got cold," he complained as he put his boots on, grabbing his pocket knife, and went to the door. "Can I use that?" he asked, holding out his hand for the flashlight. I was reluctant, but gave it to him. He opened the tent and stepped out into the night. I heard him calling out into the dark, telling them to show themselves or he'd call the police. He threatened having a gun, too. His voice faded so much that I thought he'd gone too far. After 5 horrendous minutes, he came back and handed me the flashlight. "If you hear anything again, yell out, okay?" "Okay," I whispered. The zipper was closed tight again. He got back into bed and we settled in to sleep. This time it was definitely early. Not even light out yet, but I could feel the difference between the 2 times. 2 shuffling steps that kicked bits of gravel and bark around. I whipped my head up, holding the sleeping bag up to my neck, and saw the zipper almost open. I screamed. A hand reached inside, then a head. His hair was black and short, and his skin looked pink from the cold. I remember his face so vividly because he stared at me first. His eyes were dim and unintelligent, half closed. The man's second arm got through before James clobbered the side of his head with a loose boot. The man shouted in angry pain before ducking his head out of the tent. James was standing, pocket knife in one hand and boot in the other. I don't know why, but I got to my knees and tore forward, my hand grasping for the zipper. "Haley, stop!" James shouted. My fingers clasped the freezing metal zipper and yanked down. The man on the other side yelled again, but I felt him grab the zipper from the other side. I had already managed to get it to the ground. Holding it there was difficult. The cold made my fingers numb, and I couldn't grasp the small metal very well. James was slamming his boot against the tent wall next to me, trying to hit the guy. "Open the zipper!" the guy yelled as we fought it. "Open it!" he gargled. We struggled for longer, and James gave up trying to hit the guy and tried to help me hold the zipper. There was nothing he could do. "Open this fucking zipper!" The shouting echoed off the canyon walls, and I sniffled from either the cold or sobbing, I'm not sure which. "Leave or I'll shoot," James threatened. "Liar!" the man cried with renewed fervor. The zipper went up a few inches, and 3 of his fingers pushed through. They managed to snag the front of my sleeping bag and force me to lean forward more. James sliced at the guy's fingers, and he roared at the top of his lungs. The zipper was loosened, and I was able to pull it back down again. We heard retreating footsteps skidding across the gravel. James shoved me aside and yanked open the zipper with one hand. Before I could yell for him to stop, he tore out of the tent and sped after the guy, boots skidding along the rocks. At some point, he must have put them on while I was fighting the zipper. James ran after the creep in his boxers and winter boots, brandishing a knife and yelling about killing him. Tears blocked my vision as I pulled the zipper shut and held it there. The 2 sets of footsteps died away, and I was left alone and sobbing. After a couple of minutes, it occurred to me to call the police. I didn't know where exactly we were, but I assumed they could trace my cell phone or something. I let go of the zipper and ripped open my duffel bag, still in tears. Just as I put my hand around it, I had to hold my breath to keep from sobbing again. There was a soft swishing sound, like leaves brushing against each other. Except it wasn't leaves. It was too steady. It was a man's voice whispering, "Shh." My hand clamped around my phone, and he said, "Don't cry, sweetheart." In terror, I tore across the tent for the zipper, which I managed to grab just in time. It started to lift, and I pulled it down with my numbed fingertips. "I'm trying to comfort you," the second man whispered as we struggled with the zipper. I looked up and saw that some light was showing outside, probably the moon. I could see the shadow of his crouched figure just outside, hands trying to pull the zipper up. As if he knew I was looking, his outlined head shot up to stare straight at me. "I bet you're really pretty," he said quietly. I was afraid to scream in case he got smart and decided to rip a hole in the tent to get me to shut up. Suddenly I felt his warm hand against my skin. I yelped and saw that he was pressing an open hand against the tent wall, pressing it in and contacting my bare arm. The heat radiated through the thin fabric. I screamed as loud as I could, and he pulled his hand back. Okay, baby steps. We'll get to touching as soon as you open this zipper." He was starting to get angry. His voice showed it. I looked around desperately, looking for a weapon of some kind. My phone vibrated on the tent floor. I had dropped it when I reached for the zipper. It had finally turned on. I snatched it up with one hand, pressed the power button, and entered my 4-digit code. I dialed 911 and pressed speakerphone. After the first ring, I felt pressure on the zipper loosen. Hey, no, it's okay, he whispered. Then they answered. The voice was almost deafening in the quiet struggle. 911, what's your emergency? The relief of hearing someone else's voice made me start bawling. I don't remember what I said. I was sobbing and screaming and crying. I remember watching the shadow of the man stand, punch the tent in frustration, and run off. His shadow disappeared after only a few steps. The operator stayed on the phone with me as I cried and sat in the middle of the tent in my sleeping bag, shivering from cold and fear. At first I had stayed near the door, clutching the zipper, but then I felt the sensation of fingers touching me through the tent's fabric, so I backed away and watched the zipper intently with my flashlight pointed at it. James got back and scared the living hell out of me when he raised the zipper. The operator on the phone had to calm me down once I explained that my brother had returned. James relayed our exact location to the operator, who said she was sending a police car immediately. He hugged me and apologized over and over for chasing the guy once I told him there had been a second man waiting for him to leave. A police car arrived with 2 officers. One interviewed my brother while they packed up the campsite together. The other sat with me in the warm police car. We were advised to pack up and leave immediately because of the coordination of the attack. James and the other officer packed the campsite, and I watched from the car. When they'd finished, I transferred to James's car and we drove away. The officers said they'd hang around and do a quick search of the area for other campers or anyone out there. We haven't heard back about what they've found, and I expect they won't tell us until they've caught someone. I've asked James what happened, and he was hesitant to tell me because of how freaked out I'd been. He apparently chased the guy through the woods and got turned around. The first guy apparently hung out in the darkness, taunting him and talking about what he'd do to me when he got back to the campsite. James wasn't sure which way the tent was, so when he heard the man's voice moving off, he followed, assuming the guy was heading back to the campsite. In reality, he was leading him away. After a few minutes, the guy stopped talking, and James heard 2 sets of footsteps racing through the trees away from him. It took him a while to get his bearings, and when he did, he found the campsite again. My flashlight against the tent wall acted like a beacon, and without it he might not have found the campsite so easily. The cops might have even temporarily mistaken him for one of them if he'd been out there much longer. James has apologized so many times that the words are starting to become meaningless. I just tell him I'm all right now.